last 6 chapters of Mark out of 16 are devoted to the final week of Jesus' life and the aftermath. There's a lot of emphasis on these last few days of Jesus' life. This first incident in chapter 11 that brings Jesus into Jerusalem is probably putting everything together. I wouldn't stake my life on this. Probably on Sunday before Jesus was crucified on Friday. That's certainly the most common view. I think probably is correct. You can deal with that however you want to. But look at what Jesus does here. Somebody read chapter 11, verses 1 to 10.
As they approached Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, on which no one yet has ever sat. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' you say, 'The Lord has need of it,' and immediately he will send it back here." They went away and found a colt tied at the door outside in the street, and they untied it. Some of the bystanders were saying to them, "What are you doing untying the colt?" They spoke to them just as Jesus had told them, and they gave them permission. They brought the colt to Jesus and put their coats on it, and he sat on it. And many spread their coats in the road, and others spread leafy branches which they had cut from the fields. Those who were in front and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest."
All right, he's getting close to Jerusalem. He calls 2 of his disciples, and he gives them some instructions. The instructions involve doing what?
Horse theft.
Well, not exactly theft, but horse borrowship, perhaps. Go to the village, you'll find a colt nobody's ever sat on, bring it here. And if anybody said to you, "Why are you doing this?" what are they supposed to say?
The Lord has need.
Yeah, the Lord has need of it. And he'll send it back here. I assume that Jesus had already arranged to get this colt, and, so he sends these 2 and gives them instructions of what to do. I'm impressed with the fact that at a pretty critical time, just a few days before his crucifixion, Jesus is in such calm control of everything. He is always together mentally. He's never flustered. So he calls the 2, he gives them the instructions, he tells them what to do in case somebody questions them, and he's got this, working. And so they go, and sure enough, happens just like he said. They find the colt, they untie it. Some people ask him, "What are you doing untying the colt?" And they told them just what Jesus said, and that was fine. And so they bring the colt to Jesus. So what do these people think when they say the Lord has need of it?
I'm guessing they might have misunderstood who the Lord was.
Maybe.
Jedi mind control.
I just wonder if the people who gave permission really had authority to give permission. They're just standing around, bystanders.
I guess I hate to imagine that Jesus actually did sort of lift these animals without permission.
That's why I think it was just, it was providence, arranged by God. He knew that this colt would be available because that's what was going to happen next.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think one person's guess is as good as another on that. I mean, I think that's certainly a view that can be taken. Yeah, I mean, certainly the Lord would know everything. So, I mean, from that standpoint, you could see this as just a miracle of, knowing where the colt would be and knowing that people would let him have it and things like that.
Maybe it's faith. Maybe it's faith that God would provide. And so God makes it happen to those who show perfect faith.
Well, yeah, but, how would you come to have faith that God's going to provide a colt? Unless, the only thing I can see in that is from Zechariah 9. If there's something through that. So I don't think faith is just like saying, well, I'll just believe that God's going to do this. And, I'll send somebody, I'd probably, how about a Corvette?
I guess I see it kind of along the lines of, paying the taxes and finding coins and fishes now. I know that's very miraculous.
Yes.
It's just God's providence.
Yes.
It's just like the fish and the bread, how did they know how many people was going to be there to eat? And God did provide.
Maybe so. I'm
I
not.
have a question.
Yes.
There are no Old Testament references in my side margins for this whole episode. Was this a fulfillment of prophecy?
It sort of was. Zechariah 9. It's kind of one of these prophecies that surprises us that it was fulfilled literally. At least it surprises me. But Zechariah 9:9, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even a colt, the foal of a donkey. I would think that could have been fulfilled without him literally riding on the colt. But it's like several prophecies that God fulfills literally, to kind of make sure we don't miss it. And I do believe that passage is cited in one of the other Gospels. So we know it is from there. It's not just a guess. But it does show us kind of the point about him riding in on the colt. This is a sign of humility on his part. Because he is the great king riding into his capital city. What would you expect him to be riding in?
Fiery steed.
Fiery steed or a stallion or a luxurious chariot or something like that. Donkey's colt doesn't strike you as very glorious. And I think that was the point. It's humble. Jesus is the conquering king coming into his capital on the colt of a donkey. And what do they do as he comes in? So they're trying to keep him from getting through? That's kind of what I would think first. But actually, what was their purpose in this?
Rolling out the red carpet.
I think exactly. This is, they're putting a carpet down, even of their own cloaks, for Jesus to ride over as he comes in. You know, this colt won't be getting its feet muddy. Is it feet on a colt? I don't know.
Hooves.
Hooves. Yeah, hooves. Hooves. I grew up right in this transition line between the roof and the roof. I grew up with roof, and then I had a teacher that said it was roof, so I switched. You know, they are very excited about Jesus' arrival. They're praising him as the one who comes in the name of the Lord. They're seeing this as the coming kingdom of our father David. I think they're imagining Jesus riding in to become king, an earthly king, political king. And they are rolling out the carpet. They are shouting in praise and triumph. This is this fever peak of excitement. It's Passover season. You've got lots of Galileans undoubtedly down there who would have been very fanatically partisan for Jesus. And so Jesus is riding in. Tomorrow he'll be knocking off the Romans and taking over. That's kind of what I'm imagining they're thinking. Comments and questions?
Would there be anything like miraculous about how he was able to ride this? Because it's like a colt that had never been ridden before. So do you think it wouldn't like it too?
I don't know. I have never ridden any kind of I think I could say I've never ridden any kind of an animal. So I don't know very little about that. You know, I think the idea of this being a colt that nobody's ridden is maybe appropriate for Jesus. It hadn't been defiled by anybody riding on it. But I don't know how difficult it would have been to ride. If it was impossible to ride, then Jesus was able to do what he needed to the colt to ride it. But I really don't know anything about riding a colt.
So you think the multitude is more likely expressing their view of him being a physical king versus their view of seeing him as the fulfillment of prophecy in a spiritual sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That's what I think.
Okay.
Because they turn on him so quickly.
Yeah.
It seems like if they really, thought it was a spiritual kingdom, they wouldn't have turned on him like they did.
Yes. Yes, I agree. Other comments and thoughts on this text?
How many people were there? I keep thinking if they're going to spread their coats, their blankets out, and that's not going to go very far unless you have a lot of people or they pick them up and move them.
Remember, Jesus from time to time has been dealing with some pretty humongous crowds. So I'm assuming at least several hundred, but very possibly several thousand.
Where is Bethphage and Bethany to Jerusalem?
They're really close. I forget on which side.
Like miles?
Yeah, like
miles?
a couple miles.
I assume that they went all the way to Jerusalem.
I suppose it's possible they didn't start right at Bethany and Bethphage either. I don't know.
So the word is out that he's back, he's coming.
This is not one of the secret arrivals. He's been headed for Jerusalem for a while
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
That seems to have been clear. This is the showdown. It's always helpful when we just try to visualize the scenes, when we try to just see the flow of thought and try to, meditate a little bit on the applications. I mean, that's really helpful. And so let's not forget the lessons that we learn as we go through this. It's really a time of great expectation for the people. And probably this event of Jesus riding into Jerusalem is probably on Sunday, and he'll be crucified on Friday. So we can pretty carefully determine the dates, the days of the week almost here in these accounts. And the next section is rather an involved section, typical Mark, even though I think this was because the events occurred this way, but you have a story within a story. And anytime you have a story within a story, I think you ought to look for the connections of those two stories. So we'll read the whole thing and then try to figure out what this is all about. Somebody read 11 to 26.
Jesus entered Jerusalem and came into the temple, and after looking around at everything, he left for Bethany with the 12, since it was already late. On the next day, when they had left Bethany, he became hungry. Seeing at a distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples were listening. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. And he began to teach and say to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a robber's den?" The chief priests and the scribes heard this, and began seeking how to destroy him, for they were afraid of him, for the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching. When evening came, they would go out of the city. As they were passing by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots up. Being reminded, Peter said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered." And Jesus answered, saying to them, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be taken up and cast into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says is going to happen, it will be granted him. Therefore I say to you, all things for which you pray and ask, believe that you have received them, and they will be granted you. Whenever you stand praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father who is in heaven will also forgive you your transgressions. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father who is in heaven forgive your transgressions."
Okay. So, Jesus in 11 comes into Jerusalem, into the temple, looks around, and leaves on Sunday, we think. Early the next morning, he's coming back from Bethany. By the way, what famous family lived in Bethany? Yes, Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And maybe who he's staying with at this point. I think that's a logical conjecture. But he comes back in, and he's hungry, and what does he see? There's a fig tree in leaf. And he comes up to see if there's any figs on it. Are there? No. Only leaves, no figs. Why weren't there any figs on this tree? Yeah, it wasn't the season for figs. And what does Jesus do? Yeah, basically he puts a curse on the fig tree. May no one ever eat fruit from you again. That seems a little odd, don't you think? You know how many inanimate objects that Jesus cursed? We don't have time to scratch our heads long because we get immediately into the next story, this story that's engulfed by the story of the fig tree. We'll have occasion to come back and think about the purpose and meaning of this fig tree incident. So they come on into Jerusalem, come into the temple. When we say he came into the temple, what do we really mean?
The temple complex, the whole big area, not like the Holy of Holies or anything like that.
Yes, not even like the holy place, not even like the courtyard where the altar of burnt offering and the laver was. Only, priests and Levites would even be in that area. But there were a series of courtyards around that. And Jesus was in those courtyards that were surrounding what we might have thought of as the temple itself. What did he find in the temple here?
People buying and selling goods.
So is this kind of like a flea market or a supermarket, or what are they buying and selling?
They were money changers, and they were also buying and selling doves.
Okay. Why buying and selling doves? Yes, one-stop shopping. You know, you can get certified clean animals right there in the temple, and you don't have to bring them with you. Many of the people, especially during the Passover season, that would come here to the temple would be out-of-town worshipers. Maybe some of them traveled a long distance, so it's quite convenient. You buy your animals for sacrifice right there and just bring it right there to the temple personnel, and they'll sacrifice it for you. So they made this very convenient for the worshiper, and perhaps somewhat convenient for themselves. You know, it's certainly a good place to set up shop if you're wanting to sell sacrificial animals. What about this money changer business? Why have money changers there at the temple? You're right. And why would they have especially needed that kind of money? But there was a tax on the temple.
Half shekel.
Yes, that half shekel tax that had to be paid in the Jewish coin. And so at least for that, they needed money changers to be able to pay that tax. Well, one of them is Matthew 17, where the people ask Peter whether Jesus paid that tax or not. That's Matthew 17:24 and following. My marginal notes suggest a couple of passages. Exodus 30:13, I'd have to look at it. I don't remember exactly where in the Old Testament it talked about that tax. That's a good one. Exodus 30:13. This is what everyone who is numbered shall give, half a shekel, according to the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel is 20 gerahs. Half a shekel is a contribution to the Lord. So every person had to pay the half shekel temple tax. And so things were proceeding along quite well in the temple that particular day when Jesus comes in, but it didn't continue that way long. What did Jesus do? Now, do you have a picture of this in your mind? What would your impression of this had been if you'd been there?
There's a crazy man running through the temple courtyards, pushing everybody out and turning things over and causing a ruckus.
Yes. Leanne?
Who does he think he is?
Yes. This is violent.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of mayhem. Running the people out, apparently from some of the other accounts, made a whip to, I assume, use on the animals. When we say overturning these tables, now what are you envisioning? You know, get two guys, pick it up, turn it over, sit it down lightly. Yeah, I'm picturing him just going through and just knocking these things helter-skelter, the coins going everywhere, on a rampage. And he was angry. He was infuriated. And just, wow. I don't know, would you go somewhere and do that? I mean, I don't know what would be a good parallel for us. This is maybe a little bigger than what we need to think of, but can you think of somebody going into Walmart and running out everybody and starting to knock down the shelves and knock off the stuff, doing things like that? What would you think if somebody started doing that? Police, yeah, absolutely. And or even somebody comes into the church building and, gets a whip and starts cracking it and sending people out and overturning the pews and the Lord's Supper table and the pulpit stand and whatever. I mean, we'd be, I don't know. You would not soon forget that. So this really, just on the surface, this is an action of Jesus that doesn't seem to fit his character. At least, not the character we've come to think of Jesus as having. Would you expect Jesus to do something like this? What does it seem?
Out of control.
Yeah, it really does. Seems like he's lost his temper, or maybe his mind. It's out of control. You expect him to be calm and meek and controlled and all that. Do you have any idea why he'd do something like that? So, who's God to Jesus? What would happen if, well, most of you live at home, but you can imagine if you're somewhat older, I guess even if you're living at home, you go into your parents' house. Maybe they've left town for a few days or whatever, and it's been invaded. I mean, people have taken over the house. And they're having a big party, and they're selling stuff. They've got customers coming in right and left, trampling on the carpet, and, maybe they got animals in there they're selling, and, what would you do?
Get out of my house.
I mean, that would be infuriating. If this is your parents' house, you just wouldn't put up with that. It'd just be wow. I think that's Jesus' attitude. What they've done in his Father's house is an outrage. Because it was supposed to be his Father's. It was a house of prayer, and they turned it into a stockyard and a money-changing place. This is wow. He is upset. Jesus gets upset when his Father is disgraced and blasphemed. Comments and questions, thoughts as we're going through this.
Why does he do this now instead of in verse 11?
That's an interesting question. It says he left for Bethany with the 12 since it was already late. Could it be that Jesus intentionally chose prime time to receive maximum exposure? And so he looked around, he sized things up, and then he left and came back at a time when everybody'd be there. That'd be my take.
And since it was late, some of them may already have been gone.
Sure. Not as much business going on.
Did they know who he was?
Yeah, I would think so. At least, I think a sizable number would have known who he was. Certainly, the Jewish leaders knew who he was. Jesus had been in Jerusalem a few times. There's a lot of Galileans down there, too, and a lot of people in Galilee knew who he was. So, not that every single person would have known who he was, but yeah, he was a pretty well-known figure. That's my feeling about it.
Was it mentioned or permitted in the old law to buy your sacrifice like that? I'm thinking of the Passover lamb, and it's like you're supposed to get it on one day and then keep it for a week or however long it is, and then slaughter it.
I don't have a good answer to that. In practicality, it probably wasn't possible for people coming from a long distance to bring their own animals. But I don't know that there's any real provision in the law for buying them. Other thoughts and comments?
And why do you think ultimately, though, if he was doing this at this time in order to have a greater audience, do you think it was to make the impression upon them about the attitude they ought to have toward God so that more would see that? Is it so that more would maybe become outraged at him, and have more of a desire to put him to death?
I would assume that he wants the people to see his zeal for God. And he wants them to do the right thing. But I think also this is showing some of the reason behind God's anger with the Jews. I think this is all connected with really the crisis that is going on. As the people are rejecting Jesus, the Lord is rejecting the people. And he's rejecting their temple. I mean, really, the place where God's dwelling is changing. He's no longer dwelling in this physical temple. He's dwelt in Jesus, and then he'll dwell in Jesus' people. And so I think this may be part of that whole conflict. Jesus has a lot to say in Matthew, especially about the Jewish, the Pharisees and scribes and all their errors, and then goes into the, as he does in Mark, the destruction of Jerusalem and all that sort of thing. And so I wonder if this isn't a part of that.
It doesn't give a lot of detail to the story, so you don't see a lot of the maybe the feeling and the emotion. I've often wondered how he could even accomplish that. It seems like the people would rebel, and if they're really entrenched in that and whatever, but it gives no indication that that he used any miracle or anything to accomplish it. He just drove them out.
Well, and you know another thing that ought to be brought in here that's kind of, I'm not sure what this does to all these questions, but this isn't the first time he did it. He did it in John 2, at the beginning of his ministry. Very, very similar. And there's plenty of people, various, stripes who think it's the same event. I don't think it can be the same event. I think John's clearly placing it early in Jesus' ministry, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke are clearly dating this one at the end of his ministry, or Matthew and Mark. I think Luke does this too, I don't remember. But anyhow, so I think there are two. But it's in twice. He manages to do it. I don't know the answer to that for sure. I suppose there could be some sense in which somebody who just comes in with great frenzied zeal, sometimes they do quite a bit before they get stopped. Nobody's really expecting it. It's kind of, it's kind of almost happens before you realize what's happening. Some have suggested, I don't know how to evaluate this. Could it be that the people sort of knew they weren't supposed to be doing this anyway? And that their conscience may have also... If you feel guilty, you're more quick to withdraw. If you know you're doing something wrong, somebody questions you, okay, I won't. Yeah,
Then he begins to teach.
Yes. Which tells you what?
I could see the timid people peeking back in the door and, he's calmed down now and now he's teaching.
Well, what does that show you about Jesus?
His intentions.
Yes. While this is a very powerful display of outrage, Jesus really is not out of control. This is not Jesus losing his temper and blowing up. He's doing what he purposes to do. He is angry, but angry in a controlled way. So and the fact that he starts teaching shows that. Well, what about this question? I might as well throw this out since I brought this up. A lot of people ask. What about if Jesus did this at the beginning of his ministry? Why were they back doing this again?
Because he left.
I think that's exactly right. I always will remember, this reminds me so much of this. When we were passing out flyers a lot of times on the streets of Sao Paulo, there were certain times where the city government would go through, on these are pedestrian streets, and there would be street vendors with big blankets and big pieces of plastic, things like that set up shop, selling all kinds of stuff, trinkets and clothes and I don't know, whatever. Practically anything you wanted to buy, you could buy from the street vendors that were technically the black market. Technically they were not legal. They were not paying taxes. Half of Brazil's economy doesn't pay taxes, half of it's underground. They could sell cheaper and whatever. But there were times when the city government would come through with their big truck and, 3 or 4 thugs, and they'd come through and drive through and grab this stuff. Well, of course, you know what happened. As soon as they started coming through, you've never seen a street be transformed any quicker in your life. Suddenly, whoo, everybody vanishes. They go into doors and where are they going? Well, when I suddenly saw, whoo, I knew the truck must be coming through. And I never will forget. I wish I had gone to try to encourage him or do something. I thought about it and I didn't. Maybe I'd have gotten in trouble. But there was one probably 12-year-old, 11-year-old boy that they had grabbed his blanket or whatever with his stuff. And he was fighting them tooth and toenail, screaming and crying and carrying on. And I never stayed with him to see what happened to him. But thinking back, I realized probably he was going to be really responsible to somebody for that. And, you could tell he was just so upset. And I wish I'd have gone and, given him $50 or something to help him out with that. But the thing I pointed that out for is, it's fascinating because I was standing there passing out flyers and you'd see that happen. In about 30 or 45 minutes, one would come back, then another, and within 2 or 3 hours, you never knew what had happened. It was hilarious. I don't know. I think the city government was probably just more or less making a point, or maybe even trying to impress the shopkeepers that would maybe not have wanted these street vendors that, yeah, we're trying to do something. I don't know. But so I can certainly imagine in 2 or 3 years, These people come back and, continue to go on as if nothing happened. But for some reason, they do allow Jesus 2 different times to do this. So it may be that they've got a guilty conscience.
This would have been like a busy season for them
Yes,
as well.
yes.
If they had stayed away at other times, it's just the normal flow of traffic in and out of the temple, but we're coming up on a feast day, and there are going to be more people, there's going to be more business, you can't miss out on.
And the first cleansing was at the Passover as well. Yeah, both times.
What they were doing wasn't technically wrong, just the way they were doing it.
Yeah. That's what I think.
It just amazes me how focused we're going to see later about when the scribes and chief priests hear about it, how physical they had become. All these things they were focused on about the money and all these other things. It was no longer about praising God. It was no longer about worshiping Him. It was all about what they could get out of it. And I can't help but wonder if we don't do that sometimes as well. We served God for so long, we might come to think, and maybe even unconsciously, what am I getting out of this? And I can see that in my life sometimes.
Which leads, I think, into, so what's the deal with the fig tree on either side of this? Do you see the connection?
And the physical and the spiritual side of it, I guess, the faith and what it appears on the outside and what it really is. I mean, kind of a contrast or a object lesson or something like that. Both of them, I think.
Yes, I think that's on the right track. What's the problem with the fig tree?
Not getting fruit.
No fruit. What's the problem with the Jewish nation?
No fruit.
No fruit. Plenty of leaves. Lots of show. But no real fruit. There's no real commitment to the Lord. Yes?
My church just did a study through this. I go to Mount Pleasant. And we talked also about how, it can also represent, being a Christian. The people there were, on the outside, they were like a big show. But they weren't bearing any fruit. They weren't doing anything for Jesus. And that fig tree wasn't bearing any fruit. It wasn't doing anything for Jesus. So that's why he cursed it. Because that's not the type of Christian that we're called to be.
Yeah. And the fact that we may have lots of leaves may be deceptive and may make us think we're doing okay. They were doing big business in the temple. Lots was going on, lots of activity. Almost makes you think they must be doing fine. The fig tree had lots of leaves, looked good, seemed to be thriving, but there was no fruit. And you can apply this to our individual lives. You can apply it to churches. There's churches that, may have beautiful buildings, may have, moving worship services, may have big programs of various sorts, but there's no fruit. There's no love. There's no faithfulness to what God says. It takes more than just the activity and the appearance. It takes fruit. And I think what happens to the fig tree, as we're going to see in a minute, is really what God was going to do to the whole nation. They weren't bearing fruit. God was going to curse them and they were going to wither. And you see it right here in the temple. This is their house of worship. This is God's house, a house of prayer for all the nations. And they've turned it into something, very unworthy of that. They really weren't bearing fruit. They just had a lot of leaves. So it is good. You think about the temple of God today. What would you say the temple of God is today? All right? Debbie's pointing to our body. 1 Corinthians 6 shows that. So in our body, in our lives, are we bearing fruit, or do we just have leaves? What else is the temple?
The church.
The church. Ephesians 2, 1 Corinthians 3. So as Christians, even together, are we putting on a show that seems impressive? Or are we really bearing the fruit of righteousness and good works and faithfulness to God? All right, comments and thoughts through verse 17.
Said they made it a robber's den. The robber's den is not where the robbers do their robbing. It's where the robbers go to count their spoils and be their hideout or their safe zone, and that's what they felt like in the temple. They were untouchable there.
Exactly. That's precisely right. That's Jeremiah 7, where in Jeremiah's day, they kept saying, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. They thought they could never be destroyed, that God would never judge them because they had the temple. Well, he said, you made it into robber's den. You're just using the temple as kind of a rabbit's foot to exempt you from punishment, even though your conduct is corrupt. And that's the way these leaders have done. Their lives are wrong, but they've got the temple, and it's kind of their hideout. It's kind of their security blanket. And little did they know the Lord was going to bring it crashing down around them. Well, the chief priests and scribes hear this, and man, they're ready to get rid of him. They are so angry. I mean, Jesus come into their very business and tried to tell them how to run things and, run people off and, whatever. I mean, this is just, man, they are so upset. But they got a problem. What's their problem? Yeah, the people are impressed with Jesus. If they tried to just come and arrest him by force, they'd probably get mobbed to death. So they want so badly to get rid of him. They got to watch it. They're going to lose their necks. So then, evening comes, they go out of the city, coming back in the next morning, and lo and behold, the fig tree. What's happened to it?
Withered from the roots up.
Yeah, just the same way that the nation and the temple will be. And Peter's like, look at this fig tree, the one that you cursed. It's withered. What do you see in that?
Like fish.
A little slow, like he's surprised. I do believe to the very end, every new miracle shocks the disciples. Is there any time Jesus did something new and they're like, well, yeah, we'd expected that. And isn't that where we are? We know we should be able to trust the Lord, but every new crisis we despair, unwilling to trust him in this one, because we've never seen him handle this one. He's handled all the others, but this is a different one. And it's just amazing. Jesus does something kind of interesting with this. He really doesn't present the lesson that I think is obvious so far. Jesus goes a step beyond this. He takes us in a different direction. Something we probably wouldn't have even thought about thinking about with this. He says, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says is going to happen, it will be granted to him. So what does Jesus use this as a lesson for? Having faith in what sense?
In what you ask for?
Yes. Having faith in God's answering prayer. Having faith and therefore turning to him in prayer and trust. They're surprised the fig tree withered up. Jesus is saying, well, don't be surprised. Whoever says to this mountain be taken up and cast in the sea, that it'll have, just you're surprised because it's a fig tree. And he generalizes to say, whatever, you ask for. All things for which you pray and ask, in verse 24, believe that you've received them and they will be granted you. Now, I've often thought about that dream. Remember what God told Solomon in a dream?
Ask for anything.
Yeah. Ask for whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Remember what Solomon asked? Wisdom. Did God give it to him?
Everything else.
Yeah. Read Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Yeah, gave him a ton of wisdom. And, but have you ever thought, wow, wouldn't it be awesome God comes to you in a dream one night and says, hey, whatever you want, whatever you ask for, I'll give it to you. Oh, wow. Well, what about this? That's not a dream. That's what God's promised all of us. And I think that thinking about it that way ought to be helpful to us. Now, that raises a few questions, like, ever known anybody levitate a mountain? Could you?
This is literal. This says that you could.
Well, why hasn't anybody done it? Perhaps that's an obvious point to make. I haven't seen the Rockies go anywhere in a long time. What about that?
It's a sign that there's more doubt than faith. Maybe.
Well, maybe. It's not this passage, but one of the others that says a similar thing. Jesus said if you had faith like a mustard seed. I think it was Luke 17. How big's a mustard seed? So if you have just a little teensy-weensy amount of faith, and you say, and so I don't think the quantity of faith is really in question here. People say that all the time. If we really had that kind of faith. When people do that, and they focus on, the adequacy and the abundance of our faith, I think it gets things out of proportion. Because then we start focusing on us and how much faith we have. I think the point of this is the power of God, not. In fact, some people will talk about the power of faith, power of believing, even the power of positive thinking. And it becomes all that you can do if you really believe. Well, this is not anything about all you can do with anything. It's what God does when you turn to Him. And it's not because you had such incredible faith. Mustard seed faith will do. So I don't think the answer to understanding this is in trying to enlarge the faith and make it something that practically nobody's ever managed to have. But the fact remains, I haven't seen many mountains going anywhere. So what do you do? How do you deal with that?
Is it figurative language?
I think it is.
So I have a theory then.
All right, what's your theory?
Well, he talks about this mountain, the mountain of the Lord, being taken up and cast into the sea. And you have the mountain representing the Word of God and the sea representing the nations. And so the Word of God is being spread over the nations.
Whoa!
Which, if you're asking and you don't doubt, this does happen. You do spread the Word that way. That's
creative.
It's in theory.
That's creative. I think that might be too specific.
Okay.
But that is creative. That's cool. I had never thought about that. What if we generalize a little bit more and think about the use of mountain imagery in the Bible? Now, there's a lot to be said about this. I've got a sermon I preach on this. I didn't bring my notes, so if you want any more references than what I can think of off the top of my head, I've got a few more. But I want you to think about how the Bible uses mountains. A great passage for this is Zechariah 4, which is in the context of Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets, motivating the people of Israel to begin again the daunting project of building the temple after they quit with just the laying of the foundation. Zechariah 4 and verse 6. Then he said to me, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, who's the governor who's overseeing the project, saying, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. What are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you will become a plain, and he will bring forth the top stone with shouts of grace, grace on it. Now, he's telling Zerubbabel, and you can look on down even a little bit farther. Verse 9 says Zerubbabel will finish the temple. He laid the foundation, he'll finish it. But this is encouragement to Zerubbabel that even though this appears to be an overwhelming task, God is saying not by human strength but by his Spirit it will be accomplished, and the great mountain that's before him, this impossible task it so seems, God will turn that great mountain into a plain. And he's going to accomplish this even though it seems insurmountable. That would be a good biblical illustration of a mountain that God says he will remove if we ask him. Because this mountain was removed by God, turned into a plain, so that Zerubbabel could do his work. Now there's another passage on mountain moving that you all know. You might not have thought about it in this way. But I bet almost everybody in here knows the passage. What is it? In the prophets, quoted in the New Testament. No, Isaiah 2 has a mountain. But different chapter of Isaiah.
Mountains being shaken.
No, Isaiah 40. Remember that? You'll know this when you get there. And remember what the fulfillment of this was. Isaiah 40 and verse 3, a voice is calling, clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness, make smooth in the desert a highway for our God, let every mountain be lifted up and every mountain and hill be made low, and all that. You remember who that's talking about? John the Baptist, who smoothed the path for the coming of Jesus. Through his preaching, the mountains were brought down, the valleys were filled up, and he allowed a clear path for the Lord Jesus to come. So there's another, perhaps impenetrable barrier that God smooths out through the preaching of John the Baptist. Here's another passage, Isaiah 41. Isaiah 41, yeah, I love this one. I don't know if you know this passage, but this is cool. Isaiah 41:14. Do not fear, you worm Jacob, you men of Israel. I will help you, declares the Lord, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. Now, how's he picturing Israel, Jacob there as a what? Worm. Now, some of you heard me talk about this passage before, surely, but what's the biggest characteristic of a worm?
Eats dirt.
Eats dirt, spineless, small, but
Disgusting.
We've got a colloquial word we use for a worm that I think sums up a worm's characteristics.
Slimy.
Squishy.
Squishy.
And that a worm has absolutely no structure. You know, there's no bones, I think a worm's about the squishiest thing there is. Wouldn't you agree? Even a little kid step on a worm and it just squishes all over the place. So he pictures God's people as a worm. And then look at verse 15. Behold, I've made you a new sharp thrashing sledge with double edges. You will thrash the mountains and pulverize them. It will make the hills like chaff. You will winnow them and the wind will carry them away and the storm will scatter them. Now, I'm not sure which figure to think of this as being. Here's the one I like. I'm not sure it's the best one. I like the idea of this mountain being like what the enemies are throwing on the worm to try to squish it. How big a mountain would it take to squish a worm? Yeah. So this is like overkill. Can you imagine that the nation's picking up this huge mountain and they're throwing it onto this worm? This thing will splatter, to smithereens. Except God makes Israel into this huge chopper and just pulverizes the mountain and spits it out as dust that the wind carries off. That's what God does to a mountain when it's a force that's ranged against his people. Or maybe the better image is the worm is facing a mountain that he's trying to go through. And so this chopper just eats its way right through the mountain and he's able to go through the tunnel. I'm not sure which of those figures is the right one, but either way, the idea is the mountain represents things like powerful forces, formidable tasks, impenetrable barriers, that by God's strength are dissolved for God's people. So I think with that, and perhaps some other passages that I'm not remembering at the moment, that we ought to see the mountain being cast into the sea reference as Jesus not trying to say, hey guys, try your hand at Mount Tabor, see what you can do, but use a common biblical metaphor to say that, hey, withering this fig tree is nothing. What the Lord's able to do in response to prayer, in terms of all sorts of mountains and tasks and impossible situations, is much greater. You think about how many times spiritually we have a task that seems like a mountain. We have opposition that seems like a mountain. We have a temptation that seems like an irresistible mountain. But God is stronger than the mountain. And the same God that withered the fig tree can deal with the mountains in our lives. And we need to trust him and turn to him. And so Jesus turns this into a lesson for the disciples. You ask, and God will take away the mountain. Now, clearly, one thing that perhaps ought to be added as we're talking about this to be complete is that this praying, believing, means more than just thinking God will do it. Sometimes when people talk about praying in faith, they just mean, well, you got to actually really think it'll happen. Well, praying in faith, in my understanding, is praying based upon God's promises. We're not saying that we should, you pray for, a Ferrari and God will give it to you. That is not praying in faith. There is nothing in God's word or God's promises that indicates that he even wants you to have a Ferrari. So praying in faith is praying based upon what God has said, based upon his word, based upon his indication of his will. And when people turn prayer into some sort of an instrument to just gain their selfish will, they are not praying in Bible faith. That is not believing prayer. Believing prayer trusts God, not greed. So, but I think this is a really powerful passage. I think it's really encouraging to us. And I think there are so many times we face mountains. We just say, I can't do this. There's a mountain. Wow. Look what he did to the fig tree. He'll do it to the mountain. Just ask. So I think that's really cool, really encouraging. What are your thoughts and comments?
And it's withered from the roots up as opposed to from the branches in. It's because if you mess with the roots of a tree, it's going to be a more permanent withering than if you just mess with the branches.
An eminently permanent withering.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that is the point. Other thoughts through verse 24. Remember this passage as you come to mountains. Remember this passage when you think, boy, I wish I was Solomon. We need to have more trust in the Lord. It is amazing how many times we face obstacles, temptations, and we don't pray. We don't turn to God. He said, I'll take the mountain away. Ask me. And we try to do it on our own. And we don't ask. It's amazing what the Lord does when we do ask. He is the God who removes mountains. And I think the thing that most impresses me about God's response to prayer is it's almost always more than I expected, in a different dimension. It's almost always like I never even thought about that. I'd only ask this. God is well able. And for us to know this and not turn to him in every situation, why wouldn't we? The point is not that we need some huge degree of faith. The point is we need enough faith to ask him. That's what we need faith for. And while we're imagining, how would we ever conjure up that much faith, we don't even show basic faith to just turn to him. And in 25 and 26, there is a condition. We've got to forgive to be forgiven. And I think maybe he wants to add this so that it's clear God won't bless everyone. If we don't forgive, surely God will not forgive us. So there are some conditions associated with God listening to our prayers. And this teaching, for God to forgive you, is in several passages in the Gospels. It is very worth reflecting on. Because when you think about how repugnant your sins are to God, and he has forgiven you, we have absolutely no right to refuse to forgive anyone who sins against us. We get, so often we get annoyed with other people, and we hold a grudge and bear resentment, and how can I do that? He hurt me so much. What if God treated his enemies the way we treat ours? We who have been forgiven so much, to be miserly about our forgiveness is unconscionable. It's a textual question. In other words, some manuscripts have 26, some don't. I think the majority thinking is it's probably a place where some of the other Gospels do include that, and maybe it's brought over here from some of the other Gospels. But that's the question as to whether or not it's in the original text or not, because some of the copies have it, some don't.
I think this is definitely a lesson that the disciples, the apostles, need to learn. I mean, we kind of reminded you earlier in Mark 9 when they had tried to heal the boy who had the demon on their own strength, and they couldn't do it. And I think kind of Jesus is teaching them here, you need to go to God in prayer and ask these things. Instead of, like we mentioned in Mark 9, they didn't do that. They were all about, they thought they could do it by themselves. And definitely Jesus trying to teach them before he leaves that this is not about you. Over and over again he says this in many different ways. He's saying, trust in me, have faith in me, not in what you can do. And again, he stresses this. I think we said this before, but we can get the same way. In our service to God, we can get so self-focused, and we've overcome temptation for so long, we begin to doubt why we have. Is it of our own strength or of God's? Many times we take that for granted.
I agree. Our strength is nothing compared to the Lord's. Okay, 27 to 33.
Then they came again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, and the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him, and they said to him, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority to do these things?" But Jesus answered and said to them, "I will also ask you one question, then answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, what was it, from heaven or from men? Answer me." And they reasoned among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? But if we say from men," they feared the people, for all counted John to have been a prophet indeed. So they answered and said to him, "We do not know." And Jesus answered and said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things."
All right. The Jewish leadership asked Jesus what?
Who said you could do this?
Yeah. Who gave you the right to come into our temple and remove the furniture, and do these outrageous things? Who gave you that authority? They are calling Jesus on the carpet to give a defense and to prove that he's got the credentials to do what he did. And how does Jesus answer?
Ask them a question.
Good way to answer, don't you think? Jesus does that pretty often. What's Jesus' question for them? Tell me whether John's baptism came from God or men. Now, John was a very prominent, popular preacher and baptizer. Many went out and were baptized by him. He was not an obscure figure. And so Jesus asking the religious leaders, was John the Baptist's baptism from heaven or men? That's a great question to ask about a lot of things. That's an outstanding question. Does it come from God or man? We ought to ask that about every religious teaching, every practice. You know, Jesus is giving us a good orientation as to the kind of question that's appropriate to ask. But they start thinking, what?
Politics.
What do you say? What are they thinking? What are they saying?
If it's from heaven, as it says, if it's from heaven, then he's going to say this, and then we should have followed it. And if it's from men, then all the people will be upset and we'll lose power that way. So we don't really have a good answer. And they don't actually try to answer the question. They go, all right, now, if we say it's, this, and if we say it's this, but they don't actually say, okay, we know it's this.
So that kind of reasoning shows what about them?
We don't care about the truth?
That's exactly right. Now, if you're going to answer a question honestly, your reasoning should go in what direction?
What's the truth?
Yes. If I ask the question to you tomorrow, was Sarah at the Whitsits last night? Are you going to think, well, now, if I say she was, and now if I say she wasn't, is that the way you're going to answer that? What are you going to think? Well, let's see, was Sarah there? Oh, yeah, she was. If you want truth, you're just going to ask, okay, is it true or not? When they start at, well, now, if we say this, if we say that, that tells me they're not seeking truth. They're seeking policy. They're seeking some kind of an effect. The truth really doesn't matter to them. I wonder how many times we do that. How many times do we think, let's see, if I said it, if I said this, if I said that. If you're trying to be honest, the consequences. Now maybe there might be a time you'd say, I don't want to answer. But if the consequences are determining what your answer is, as opposed to the honest truth determining what your answer is, then there's a problem. So I think Jesus exposes their hypocrisy with this question. Now they think if we say from heaven, well, why wouldn't they want to say that?
Because then they were wrong.
Yeah, why didn't you believe it? If they say from men, why didn't they want to say that?
People turn against them.
Yeah, people thought John was a prophet. So they say,
We don't know.
here are the religious leaders of the day, and they're forced to admit that they can't determine whether one of the most popular teachers of their day had a message from God or man. That's kind of embarrassing. Kind of backed into a corner that wasn't a very good option either. And Jesus said, well, you're not going to tell me that, I won't tell you either. Now, this is not Jesus just trying to be persnickety. I think Jesus was trying to lead them to answer their own question. If they had honestly answered Jesus' question, is John's baptism from God or man? Well, what would the honest answer have been? From God. Well, what did John say about Jesus?
Behold the Lamb of God.
And a bunch of other stuff that shows that Jesus had authority from God. That answers the question where his authority came from. If they would properly answer the source of John's baptism as being from God and listen to John's testimony, they can answer their own question. They'd already know where Jesus' authority came from. Jesus wasn't trying to evade the question. He was trying to lead them to answer it. But in the process, he was testing them as to whether or not they even had an honest question. No dishonest question deserves an answer. And their question was dishonest because they refused to give an honest answer to Jesus.
Like he was trying to expose their motives, and
he did a pretty good job of it.
Were they just alone? Or was there hoping people listening in?
I'm assuming there were people listening in. He was walking the temple, and these people just came to him. So I'm assuming he's in the midst of some sort of a crowd. Do you see why they didn't like Jesus? Couldn't deal with him. You know, there's not a way to pin Jesus down and leave him looking bad or there's no way to expose Jesus as being wrong, as being foolish, as being hypocritical. Jesus always says the right thing and does the right thing in every situation. That'd be infuriating for them, John.
he's the foe they can't defeat.
Yeah.
But they failed to realize that if they would simply yield to him, he would be the greatest ally they could ever want.
Exactly.
Do you think they were trying by this to maybe try to turn people against him so that they could capture him?
Well, I'm sure they'd have done it if they thought they could. I don't know if this was for that as much as it was just almost an outburst of their outrage. I don't know. But maybe also, trying to get him to say something that they can use against him. If he claims he's got special authority from God or whatever, maybe they'll call it blasphemy. So I don't know.
I can almost kind of see this in my mind. They ask Jesus, thinking they can corner him, and he throws that question. And they're like, huddle up, come on, what are we going to say? Just this honesty about this is amazing.
Yes, absolutely. Every time the question is, what are we going to say? What are the consequences? It's bad. But Jesus' question is a really good question. I think we need to get in the habit of asking that question more often.
His answer really shows their dishonesty, because they said, we do not know. But then he answers, nor will I tell you. Sort of saying,
Yes.
you won't tell, you do know.
Yes.
So anybody listening would say, you do know the answer, you just refuse to say it.
Yes. Well, they had plenty of reason to be mad, given their agenda.
This is one of those questions that they could not have come up with. Well, let's see. There's a third option here. There's not a third option.
There never is. Something's either from God or man. There's only two options on that one.
I think they get more frustrated with Jesus every time he outsmarts them.
Exactly. Yeah. They're not humble enough to recognize that Jesus is God. He's a whole lot smarter than they are. They keep thinking they can outsmart him. Other thoughts?
Back to the earlier topic of forgiveness. Why do we find forgiveness so hard? Why do some people go to their grave carrying their grudges, fully aware of what God says about those who fail to forgive?
I would say because we haven't reflected sufficiently on our need for forgiveness and the forgiveness God has given. That's what I would say. I think if we really understand the forgiveness we've received.
So we just gloss over our own forgiveness.
That's what I would say. People who are impatient with others often haven't really thought about the patience God is willing to have with them.
I also kind of think of self-importance. Think of yourself as better than someone else. Why would you forgive them if they're not as good as you are?
Yeah, we take ourselves too seriously. If our dignity and our rights and our comforts mean nothing, then it's going to be hard for us to have a grudge against anybody. Well, why don't we stop here then and work on the first part of chapter 12 next week. Appreciate your comments and your chance to